Hey there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great? Good. Today we're going to look at the question of whether low number M1903 Springfields are safe to shoot and why that question even exists. It pops up periodically and it usually sparks heated debates. I'm not sure there's a definitive answer, but let's get into it. But before we get to the opinions, let's go over the facts. Now, we in our modern age like to flatter ourselves that precision manufacturing is a relatively recent capability. The fact is that the American system of manufacturing, which arose in the 19th century, which in part promoted the interchangeability of parts in things like firearms, means that precision has actually been around for a very long time. Back in 1860, Enfield Armory in England made gauges which were capable of measuring gun parts to 100 thousandths of an inch. That's 5 places behind the decimal. Now, while manufacturers were certainly capable of that extreme precision, that doesn't mean there still wasn't room for old-style ways of manufacturing, like the eyeball method. Employees at Springfield and Rock Island, responsible for heat-treating M1903 receivers and bolts, used that eyeball method to determine the temperature that they were reaching while they were heat-treating. Now, heat-treating is essentially used to harden steel of the receiver, and if you heat treat at too high of a temperature, the metal becomes brittle. If you heat treat at too low, the metal remains relatively soft. Now, in 1917, the United States military became aware of a problem. Rifles were shattering when soldiers were shooting them. Despite the fact that the military needed every single rifle it could get its hands on for the First World War, production was immediately halted so that the issue could be investigated. Now, General Julian, no strange name to gun enthusiasts, was sent in, and what he discovered would actually be funny if soldiers weren't being injured. The armory employees were relying on the color to determine temperature, but what they didn't notice was that the color could be perceived differently depending on the ambient color of their surroundings. Simply put, on cloudy days, they tend to estimate temperatures for the heat treating fairly well, but on sunny days, their estimate could be as off as much as 300 degrees lower, prompting them to increase the heat and then make the resulting metal more brittle on those days. So in December 1917, pyrometers, which are essentially a remote sensing thermometer, were installed at both armories to accurately measure the temperature. At Springfield, that came in at about serial number 800,000 for the rifles, while at Rock Island, it was at 285,507. Everything below those numbers is what we refer to as low number rifles. Now, it's hard to say how many people were actually injured by these rifles before the heat treating was improved. In 1917, about a dozen rifles shattered when fired and injured one person severely and several others a little more minorly. And between that year and 1929, a total of 43 soldiers were injured, which includes 3 men losing an eye each. Now, from what I've been able to tell, about 5 dozen rifles in total were verified by the military to have shattered by the end of the 1920s. Now, from there, the hard data essentially ends. The military explored withdrawing the rifles from service, but ultimately continued to use low-number rifles until the end of the Second World War. Since then, all we have are "I heard of a guy" stories. That said, let's consider what we actually know. Number 1, low number rifles have a reasonable probability of being improperly heat treated. No one investigating the issue in 1917 and on, whether it was the US military or the armories themselves, denies this. How many is what we're uncertain of. We know that the total production of low number rifles is just over 1 million. Number 2, all improper heat treating is not the same. Some of it may have been marginally too high, some of it may have been grossly out of spec. Where that line is that makes a rifle far more dangerous is something that no one really knows. Number 3, the rifles were manufactured between 1903 and 1917, making them between, at least as of this video's recording, between 104 and 118 years old. And 4, the number of rifles that proved defective, which we can link to the heat treating, is fairly low. Now, people who dismiss concerns about low number M1903s argue that anything that would have happened with one of these rifles likely would have occurred years ago, and that most of the dangerous rifles have essentially been removed from the system, whether by the US military or by collectors aware of the possible dangers. The obvious counterpoint, of course, is that there are still plenty of low number rifles out there, and just because something hasn't happened to any individual rifle yet doesn't mean that it eventually won't. So, to get to the question, are these rifles dangerous to shoot? Well, here's a clear and definitive answer. I don't know. The experts exploring the issue in 1917 seemed to think it was serious enough to halt production during the war, a world war, investigate, then change the heat treating methods. But at the same time, no one had a real appetite to withdraw those rifles from service until the 1940s. That said, I think a few things need to be taken into account if you do own a low number M1903 and are tempted to shoot it. First is that you have no way of knowing whether your rifle's receiver and bolt were heat treated on a cloudy day or a sunny day, which means you have no idea if it was properly heat treated. The second is that your rifle is over a century old. It may well have seen action in 2 separate world wars and has been privately owned for decades, with who knows what kinds of ammunition, loads, and volume fired through it during that period. It's safe to say that your rifle has had as many things go through it as a middle-aged porn actress. The reality with brittle receivers is that they could shatter at any point. You don't know what your low number rifle's lifespan in rounds fired is. What you do know is that it's seen a century of full power rounds, and that it could carry a horrible flaw which could manifest on any trigger pull. And those dangerous rifles are still out there. There was a story on the Firearm blog a few years ago which detailed someone buying a low number Rock Island rifle and only discovering cracks in the receiver because he decided to give it a really good cleaning, something that a lot of people fail to do before taking their new prize out to the range for the first time. Now you can see a picture of one of the cracks on the screen. This wasn't 3 decades ago, this was 3 years ago. These rifles are still out there and potentially close to failing. As the writer in the TFB essay stated, and I'm going to read his exact words, between the 3 of us, the guys in the shop and I, have well over a century in the gun business with tens of thousands of guns bought and sold and handled and examined, and none of us had seen one before now. Just because you haven't seen something yourself doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, engineers and metallurgists will argue about distribution curves involving failure rates, and some people argue that if a rifle survives its early use without issue, that the subsequent failure rate is negligible. While others will argue right back that failure rates tend to rise sharply near the end of life. And in cases like flawed manufacture, you don't know what that end of life is. I'm not wise enough to offer an educated opinion on these matters, but I will come at it from what I think is a pragmatic perspective. Why take the risk? M1903s aren't particularly expensive rifles, though prices are rising, of course. Your body is worth a considerable amount more, even if only to you. Why risk a rifle grenading next to your face? Buy another M1903 outside of the danger range of serials and shoot that. Turn the low number into a wall hanger. Brass tacks. There's no one out there that can tell you whether your low number M1903 is at risk for shattering. If you're confident that your low number rifle is completely safe, feel free to give the receiver a good hammer blow and see if it shatters. Not willing to do that? Okay. At any rate, that's my opinion on the matter, and it's worth what you paid for it. For myself, I wouldn't personally take the chance. Your mileage may vary. I hope you enjoyed today's video and that it was at least informative. I hope all that your shots ring true and that you have a great day. Bye-bye.